but these approaches weren't very efficient or very adaptable. And so our researchers, Dr. Eva Dyer from Georgia Tech and Dr. Konrad Kording from UPenn, created a new and improved approach to train these neural decoders. So first, let's talk about the supervised learning approach, a common way to train decoders that was already used prior to this research. So to train a decoder for, let's say, an arm prosthetic, the following is done. So first, a subject makes a large variety of arm movements, and then for each arm movement, the corresponding neural data is recorded and labeled with the movement. So for example, if the subject moved his arm 90 degrees left with a speed of x meters per second, his neural data while he was performing the movement would be recorded and labeled with the movement, 90 degrees left, x meters per second. So then after this is done for nearly all possible arm movements, this data is inputted into the decoders. And so now the training portion is basically over, and the decoders need to be tested because the researchers need to make sure that the decoders can output an accurate prediction of the movement data based on the neural data that they receive. So in the testing, a decoder receives an unlabeled neural recording, and it looks through its set of training data to find the most similar neural recording. So neural recording A here is very similar to this. So then it looks at the label of this similar recording, which represents the movement corresponding to this, and it's corresponding to this, and then it tells the prosthetic to execute that movement. So this is how this approach to training decoders works, but it's not very efficient because in the first place, the decoders need to have a close match in their set of training data to nearly any possible neural recording that it could receive. And secondly, a human would need to manually label every neural recording with the movement. Any questions? Okay. So to better understand the new and improved approach, let us first make an analogy to cryptography. So during World War II, the Germans used the Enigma machine to encrypt their messages. And so for a while, no one could decipher these Enigma ciphers. But then several Polish spies stole the schematic of the Enigma machines, and from that, they figured out a formula that can convert the ciphertext back to the original message, or the plain text. But the problem was that each time the Enigma machine is run, the coefficients of the formula are different. So for one cipher, the coefficients could be A is 1, B is 2, Z is 15, C is 25, and then for another cipher, A could be 6, B could be 3, C could be 10, and Z could be 15. So this is where Alan Turing and his Bletchley Park team come in. So as I'm sure many of you know, thanks to the movie called The Imitation Game, these men were the first to actually decipher or to decrypt the Enigma ciphers. And so they did this with the help of the bomb machine, which was invented by Turing himself. So they knew that many German operators started their messages with to : from : So they took one of these words, they gave one of these plaintext words, let's say to : to the machine, and they gave the corresponding cipher word. So for to : it would be the first 3 letters of the cipher, let's say XYZ, to the machine. And they also gave the formula that we discussed on the last slides of the machine. So then the machine would keep running through different possible combinations of coefficients and plug them into the formula until it found a combination of these coefficients such that when the formula is applied to the given ciphertext, in this case XYZ, it outputs the given plain text, in this case to : And so once this is achieved, then the machine would output this completed formula with the coefficients, and now the team could apply the formula to decrypt the rest of the cipher. Any questions? Okay, so this concept of finding a relationship between a cipher and the plaintext, and using this relationship to map the ciphertext to the plaintext is really important in understanding the new approach called distribution alignment decoding, or DAD. So here the ciphertext is brain signals rather than an encrypted written message, and the plaintext is movements rather than the original written message. But here the computer is still finding the coefficients for a formula that can map the ciphertext to the plaintext, so the brain signals to the movements. And also, the machine is finding this formula in a similar way. So the part of the machine's development where it figures out this formula is called the training. So in the training, first the subject makes a variety of movements, and so each of these movements, along with the corresponding neural activity, is recorded. And then once this is done for several different mechanical and neural recordings, this data is fed to the machine, and the machine should be able to figure out a formula that accurately and consistently converts the neural data, that maps the neural data to the mechanical data. So we see here that the machine does not necessarily have to be trained on every single type of arm movement, because it can receive a neural recording that is not in its set of training data, and it can simply apply the formula and predict the corresponding movement data. And also, here the machine is recording both the mechanical data and the neural data simultaneously, so a person doesn't have to sit there and label the neural data. So it's a lot more efficient. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Jessica, what kind of mechanical data are you recording? Is it like you have a speedometer on the object that someone is moving?
Well, I'll talk about that on the next slide, but it was mainly they were looking at the two-dimensional velocities and the forces of the movements. So yeah. Yeah. So how was the data to train the machines gathered? So basically, the researchers had two monkeys play a video game that required them to move a joystick with hand movements. And for each hand movement, the corresponding neural data was recorded, and the two-dimensional velocities of the movement were graphed. So here's the vertical velocity, and here's the horizontal velocity. And these are different movements, each color is a different movement. And here they had another chimpanzee play a different video game that required the chimpanzee to rotate his wrist. And so for each wrist rotation, the neural data was recorded, and the two-dimensional forces were graphed. So the y-axis is the change of vertical force over the change of time, and the x-axis is the change of horizontal force over the change of time. And again, the different colors represent different movements. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so after the decoders were trained on this data, the researchers decided to test the accuracy and adaptability across patients of the decoders. So here in this case, the decoders were trained for half the time and tested for half the time. And here in this case, they were trained for only a fifth of the time and tested for the rest of the time. So here they received a lot less training data. But in both cases, so even when the DAD trained decoders received a lot less training data, their accuracy stayed the same, because here it's 0.6 and here it's also about 0.6. But when the supervised learning trained decoders received significantly less training data, their accuracy also significantly decreased. So this shows that the decoders trained through supervised learning are a lot more dependent on the amount amount of training data, while the decoders trained on DAD can be trained on a lot less data to be equally accurate. And also, these figures show that the DAD decoders are very adaptable across patients. So here we have 3 decoders, and each of these was tested on the same patient, but they were trained on different patients. So even though they were all trained on different patients, the accuracy stayed the same across all decoders. So this shows that it doesn't matter who a decoder is trained on, it'll still be like almost equally accurate when it's tested. So this means that, like, for example, if someone needs a prosthetic, then first the decoder can be trained on another person and then applied to the person who needs the prosthetic. And this figure here, again, further demonstrates the accuracy of the DAD trained decoders that were trained on one person and tested on a different person. And here, the solid blue lines represent the actual horizontal velocity. And can anyone guess what the dotted blue lines represent?
The estimated.
Yeah, good. So the dotted blue lines represent the decoder's estimation of the actual horizontal velocity. So, and then here, the solid red lines represent the actual vertical velocity of a movement that was made by the test subject, and the dotted red lines represent the decoder's guess from the neural data that they received of the vertical velocity of the movement. And so the closer the dotted and solid lines are to each other, the more accurate the decoders are. So here we see that, like for most of these reaches, the dotted red lines and the solid red lines are pretty close together, and the solid blue lines and the dotted blue lines are also pretty close together. So the approach is pretty accurate overall. Are there any questions? Okay. So next, the researchers decided to test whether the DAD approach was adaptable over time. So if a decoder is adaptable over time, that means that it can be trained on one day and still be accurate when it's tested on another day. So here a decoder was trained on this mechanical data and the corresponding neural data on day 1. And then here it was tested on the neural data corresponding to this mechanical data on day 2. And so we can see that, and this is the guess. This is its guess of the movement corresponding to the neural data that it received from day 2. So we can see that this guess is pretty accurate because its predicted graph is very similar to the graph of the actual movement on day 2. Any questions? Okay, so to sum up, distribution alignment decoding is an unsupervised approach to training neural decoders, and the way it works is that a machine finds a formula that can map the brain signals to the corresponding motions, and then it uses this formula to predict the motion based on the brain signals that it receives. And some upsides of the new approach versus previous approaches are that, well, for one, it requires a lot less training data than, for example, supervised learning to be equally accurate, and it also requires less manual input, like less labeling. And finally, it's adaptable both across patients and over time. Okay, and so, as we mentioned, this could be applied to improving mind-controlled prosthetics, and also it could be used to figure out the intentions of people with locked-in syndrome, because people with locked-in syndrome can't really move or speak, so they can't express their thoughts. Like if they want to reach for a water bottle, it would be pretty hard for them to express that. So this research could be applied to help figure out what they want. This is a little more far-fetched, but one dangerous aspect of how this research could be used is that if it's if it's further developed a lot so that the technology can be used to not just figure out movements from brain signals, but to figure out other intentions, it could be exploited by spies. Okay, that's it.